In this video, you will learn my foolproof method of creating sourdough starter and how to use that starter to make and bake amazing sourdough bread every time. Hi, I'm Ron and thanks for clicking on this video. Please take a moment to click the subscribe button and notification bell, and remember to check out my other videos on my YouTube channel. In this video, I will demonstrate the steps to create a sourdough starter, then using that starter make sourdough, and finally baking that dough to produce amazing sourdough bread. Okay then, let's begin. It's the evening of day 1. I'm going to mix 20 grams of flour with 20 grams of liquid. The liquid will include a teaspoon of pineapple juice and enough water to bring the total up to 20 grams. The mixing flour I'm using consists of 1/3 rye flour, 1/3 whole wheat flour, and 1/3 all-purpose flour. I keep the mixing flour in this silver can and store it in the fridge. It's now the morning of day 2 and time for another feeding. I will be feeding the starter twice a day for about 10 days. The first feeding consisted of 20 grams of flour and 20 grams of liquid for a total of 40 grams. I only include pineapple juice during the very first feeding. Today I will discard 20 grams of starter, then add back in 20 grams of flour and 20 grams of water for a total of 60 grams. This is referred to as a 1:1:1 feeding ratio, meaning equal parts by weight of starter, flour, and water. Also, I feel I need to warn you that for the next minute or two, I will be going over several calculations. These are important for you to understand the feeding and discard process. It's now the evening of day 2. Of the 60 grams of starter, I will discard 30 grams of starter and add back in 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water for a total of 90 grams of sourdough starter. It's now the morning of day 3. Of the 90 grams of sourdough starter in the container, I will discard 50 grams and add back in 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water for a total of 120 grams of sourdough starter in the container. It's now the evening of day 3. Of the 120 grams of sourdough starter in the container, I will discard 60 grams and add back in 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water for a total of 180 grams of sourdough starter in the container. It's now the morning of day 4. Of the 180 grams of sourdough starter in the container, I will discard 120 grams and add back in 60 grams of flour and 60 grams of water, bringing the total back to 180 grams of sourdough starter in the container. Let me show you how I do this. Here I'm trying to show how much the starter has increased in volume since the last feeding, but I forgot to turn on my cell phone video, which you can see just to my right. However, if you look closely, you can see the piece of tape next to my right hand thumb, and the starter has risen considerably above the tape, and this is only 2.5 days since the initial feeding. Now I'm going to remove 120 grams of starter, leaving in the container 60 grams of starter, and add back in 60 grams of water and 60 grams of feeding flour. Then I'll mix all together, scrape down the sides of the container, and repeat the process in 12 hours. I will continue every 12 hours this same discard and feeding process through the evening of day 9, discarding 120 grams of sourdough starter and adding back in 60 grams of mixing flour and 60 grams of water. It's now the morning of day 10 and time to make sourdough. Unlike past feedings, today from the 180 grams of sourdough starter, I will discard 140 grams, leaving in the container 40 grams of sourdough starter, and add back in 80 grams of flour and 80 grams of water. This is a 1 to 2 to 2 feeding ratio, meaning adding twice as much flour and twice as much water as the 40 grams of sourdough starter in the container. Then I'll wait until the sourdough starter doubles in volume, which usually takes about 3 to 4 hours. The sourdough starter has doubled in volume, and it's time to make the sourdough. My recipe calls for 300 grams of water, 100 grams of sourdough starter, 450 grams of bread flour, and 10 grams of salt. I'll list the recipe in the video description. This is as close as I get to the float test. As I add the sourdough starter, I look to see if any of it floats, but I would go ahead and bake the dough whether it floats or not. I wanted you to see this. I don't always do it, but sometimes I'll give the dough a spray of water, especially if the dough seems a little dry. After mixing the dough at 30-minute intervals, I like to perform 3 stretch and folds followed by 2 coil folds, although in this video I'll only demonstrate one of each. Be sure to wet your hands to reduce the dough from sticking. After stretch and fold and coil fold, I let the dough rest until it has increased in volume by about a third, which usually takes an hour or two. Then it's time to pre-shape, shape, put in bannetons, and into the fridge overnight. It's the following morning and time to bake the sourdough. The cast iron Dutch oven has been preheating in the oven for 30 minutes at 450 degrees. I'll loosen the edges of the sourdough in the banneton so it releases easily. Then score the dough with a side-to-side cut. Oven gloves like the ones I'm wearing are invaluable, especially when handling cast iron Dutch ovens that have been preheated at 450 degrees. A few months ago, I switched from using parchment paper to the bread sling. Either will work, of course, but I much prefer using the bread sling. The bread has been baking in the Dutch oven for 30 minutes at 450 degrees. It's time to reduce the oven temperature to 400 degrees. Okay, let's get the Dutch oven out of the oven. It's so exciting to me every time I lift the lid off the Dutch oven, revealing freshly baked sourdough bread. And this time is no exception. Isn't that bread beautiful? Back into the oven for 15 more minutes. The timer just went off, signaling 15 minutes are up. It's time to remove the bread from the oven and check the internal temperature. Anything over 200 is good, and it's at 203. Perfect. Now for the hour-long wait to allow the bread to cool. It's been an hour. I'm anxious to taste the bread. Doesn't that bread look amazing? And it tastes as good as it looks. Thanks again for watching. Please remember to click the subscribe button and notification bell and leave a comment. I read all of them.